This is the true account of the 33rd Waffen SS Charlemagne Division and SS Nordland, told through the raw first-hand memories of those who were there. Most notably, we follow the perspective of French volunteer Henri Fenet as we uncover their brutal experience during the final days in Berlin and the horrific battles they endured. These are their stories as they remembered them. The once mighty divisions of the Waffen SS were now scattered remnants, retreating westward, pursued relentlessly by the Red Army. Among them, what remained of the Charlemagne division was regrouping near Anklam, barely 30 kilometers from Swinemünde. These were the last of the French volunteers, those who had survived the hell of Pomerania, the collapse of Kolberg, and the grueling marches through enemy-occupied territory. Their arrival was staggered. The first to reach Anklam were around 200 men from the transport column and divisional support units. They had fled Grossjestin in the dead of night on March 4th, with Soviet tanks on their heels, barely escaping annihilation. By noon on March 16th, SS Major General Krukenberg arrived with 23 officers and 701 survivors from the Fenet Battalion. But even as men trickled in, others vanished. Those who had escaped the siege of Kolberg, exhausted, half-starved and desperate to regroup, were inexplicably sent straight to the replacement battalion at Wildflecken. The division, already depleted beyond recognition, was further fragmented. Krukenberg wasted no time. He made his way to Himmler's field headquarters near Prenzlau on March 18th, returning with a fresh batch of promotions and decorations. Some were posthumous, medals granted to men who would never see them. Others were meant to restore morale, a small gesture to those who had fought and survived against impossible odds. But above all, Krukenberg wore his own new symbol with pride, the tricolour badge on his sleeve, marking him as the commander of France's last legion of volunteers. Even as officers struggled to rebuild order, chaos still surrounded them. On March 21st, with no trains available, the division was forced to march 4 days on foot to Neustrelitz in Mecklenburg. The roads were clogged with refugees, remnants of shattered units, and the wounded staggering westward. There, in a cluster of villages east of the town, the division finally established a new headquarters. Karpin became the centre of operations, while scattered elements took shelter in nearby settlements, Bergfeld, Grunau, Ollendorf. Then new orders arrived from SS headquarters. The Charlemagne division was to be restructured. By April 15th, it was to be reorganised into a single grenadier regiment, following the new 1945 model, 2 grenadier battalions, supported by a heavy battalion. It was a final desperate attempt to keep the unit combat ready despite its shrinking numbers. Companies were quartered throughout the countryside, assigned to locations that were little more than names on a map: Gramathin for the regimental headquarters, Goldenbaum for the heavy battalion, Fürstensee and Wocul for the battered remnants of the 57th and 58th battalions. Every surviving unit was given a place to regroup. The Charlemagne division was now part of Panzer General Hasso von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army, attached to Army Group Weichsel under Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici. Himmler was gone, replaced by a commander who at least understood war. But it was too late. The Red Army was coming. The Oder had become the last defensive line, and every available unit, including what remained of the French SS, was thrown into the desperate task of building anti-tank defences in the rolling fields and dense forests south of Neustrelitz. But the division was barely holding together. The numbers had dwindled to only 700 men. Krukenberg's first priority was to gather the rest of his scattered forces. At Wildflecken, the replacement battalion had swollen to regimental size, now reinforced by those who had escaped Kolberg. But the Martin battalion, last seen in Gotenhafen, had vanished without a trace. No reports, no messages. The men were simply gone. On March 27th, Krukenberg issued an order of the day. The words were meant to rally his men, to remind them of their sacrifices and the battles they had survived. He spoke of their last stand at Bärenwalde, where they had stopped the Soviet advance for just a few crucial hours. He praised their defiance at Elsenau and Neustetten, where 16 enemy tanks had been destroyed in a single engagement. But most of all, he reminded them of Kölln, the place where they had refused to break, where they had held on while the rest of the German army fled. The message was clear. The Charlemagne division had bled for this war, and though their numbers were fewer, their determination remained. They were still Frenchmen, still soldiers. They had fought not just for Germany, but for their own vision of Europe, a future that was now crumbling around them. Now that we have gained the esteem of the Waffen SS, Krukenberg declared, No soldier conscious of his honor can leave the ranks. But honor meant little to starving, demoralized men. The once proud unit had become fractured. Factions emerged. Some clung desperately to their belief in National Socialism. Others simply wanted to survive. Discipline cracked. Desertions increased. Looting became common. A handful of soldiers were executed by firing squad, their bodies left as a warning to others who might abandon their posts. Then came the breaking point. Orders arrived for the men to begin digging anti-tank ditches and constructing fortifications. It was the final insult. These men had enlisted to fight, not to move dirt like prisoners. The resentment boiled over into outright disobedience, and it took the personal intervention of Captain Feney, one of the division's few remaining officers with the respect of his men, to bring them back into line. He led by example, taking up a shovel himself, proving that no soldier was above the task, but the tension remained. Himmler, now desperate to maintain some semblance of control, devised a solution. In consultation with Krukenberg, he ordered the division to be split into combat and non-combat elements. Any man unwilling to fight to the end would be disarmed and reassigned to a construction battalion. The decision was put to the men with brutal clarity. "I only want volunteers," Krukenberg told them. "You may abandon the armed fight. You will remain in the SS, but as workers. I only want to have combatants with me now." The division broke. 1 officer and 400 men, mostly former members of the milice, chose to lay down their arms. Captain Roy, much against his will, was placed in command of this reluctant construction unit. Others, like the Corsican officer Charlemagne, were furious. He refused to abandon the fight and was instead demoted to a company commander within the construction battalion. These men were quietly moved to the village of Druin, far from the combat-ready forces, but others stood firm. The elite Compagnie d'Honneur, nearly all of Fenet's 57th Battalion and half of the 58th Battalion refused to surrender their weapons. They would fight to the last. On April 10th, what remained of the Martin Battalion finally rejoined the Charlemagne. Only 100 men had survived their long retreat from Gotenhafen. More reinforcements were expected. 1,200 troops under SS Lieutenant Colonel Hirscher, who had begun their journey from Waldflecken on March 30th. Also on their way were the men of the Assault Gun Company, though their promised Hetzers had been seized en route. They too would fight as infantry. Meanwhile, back in France, the world had already moved on. General de Gaulle's provisional government had been established in Paris. Marshal Pétain and his Vichy loyalists had been exiled to Sigmaringen, cut off from the outside world. To the French SS still fighting in Germany, it was a bitter realization. There would be no return home. There would be no final victory. The Charlemagne was no longer a division. It was a handful of men scattered across a dying Reich, waiting for the inevitable. And yet, they still prepared for battle. The final fight was near. The Red Army was coming. It was 4 a.m. on April 24, 1945, when SS Major General Krukenberg was awoken by 2 separate phone calls, one from the Waffen SS personnel office in Fürstenberg, the other from Army Group Weichsel near Prenzlau. The message was clear. He was to immediately travel to Berlin and take command of the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, replacing General Ziegler, who had been relieved due to health issues. Berlin was already surrounded on 3 sides. Marshal Rokossovski's 2nd Belarusian Front had just launched its final offensive across the Oder, and the city's defences were crumbling. Inside the capital, the last forces of the Reich were being thrown into a desperate final battle. There was no time to hesitate. Krukenberg requested permission to take part of his staff and a detachment of 90 men. His request was granted. Among those selected was Captain Henri Feney, already decorated with the Iron Cross First Class for his leadership in Pomerania. These would be the last of the Charlemagne division to enter the doomed city, a final stand for the French SS in Hitler's crumbling capital. The column was small, 2 buses and 3 trucks. The plan was to take the safest route still open, travelling through Oranienburg and Frohnau, then slipping into Berlin before the Red Army could complete its encirclement. Departure was set for 8:30 a.m. from Alt-Steglitz. But time was running out. By midnight, Krukenberg received yet another order. He was to form an assault battalion from the remains of the Charlemagne division and send them to Berlin without delay. There was no question of waiting. Those who could move would move now. The Storm Battalion was assembled quickly. 3 companies from Battalion 57, 1 from Battalion 58, and the elite Compagnie d'Honneur from the Divisional Combat School. The battalion was lightly equipped. Most carried automatic weapons, MG-42s or MP-44 assault rifles. The rest were armed with Panzerfausts, the last hope of stopping Soviet armor. The goal was simple: reach Berlin before the Soviets cut them off completely. They set off before dawn. The road was chaos. The main highways were flooded with refugees, retreating soldiers, and shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht moving westward. The deeper they pushed, the more they realized how close the Red Army was. At Nauen, their column came under air attack. Further ahead, at Wustermark, Soviet artillery rained down on them. The roads ahead were blocked, forcing them onto smaller paths, moving through forests and fields. But just as they neared the village of Falkenraid, disaster struck. They were at the last canal before Berlin, one final bridge, a heavy sandstone structure, the last way in. As the Charlemagne column approached, 3 Volkssturm militiamen on the far side mistook them for the enemy. In a panic, they detonated the charges and blew the bridge. It was over. The vehicles, now useless, had to be abandoned. Some trucks turned back toward Neustrelitz, but many were lost. Of the original convoy, only 3 trucks made it to Karpen, carrying just 90 men. The rest, 300 men, carrying nothing but their weapons and ammunition, were now on foot. Berlin was still over 20 kilometers away, and they would have to march. By 3 p.m., after hours of moving through shattered towns and villages, they reached Pichelsdorf, slipping past Soviet patrols. The roads were eerily empty. The great bridges across the Havel, normally guarded, were barricaded but abandoned. The sound of war was getting closer. As night fell, the exhausted men collapsed in the Grunewald forest, just outside the Reich sports field. Nearby, the Pichelsdorf Bridge, one of the last intact crossings, was being shelled relentlessly by Soviet artillery. Henri Fene later described the final hours of their march into the city. They had been marching for hours, their muscles taut, their breath short. The closer they got to Berlin, the heavier the air became. The night was alive with machine gun fire, the steady crack of Soviet snipers, the deep rumble of artillery. At some point, exhaustion took over. They stopped thinking about how much farther they had to go. They just moved, driven by instinct. Berlin was just ahead. The last battle was waiting. A violent explosion ripped through the night. The deep, echoing boom sent a shockwave rolling through the valley. A Soviet aircraft, circling like a vulture, had just dropped a bomb near the bridge. For a long moment, the night air was filled with the fading roar of destruction. Then, as if the city itself had grown used to such violence, silence returned. The only sound left was the restless breathing of exhausted men, stretched out under the cold sky in the Grunewald forest. Sleep did not come easily. At midnight, SS Major General Krukenberg had set off in a confiscated vehicle, accompanied by SS Captain Pachur. His destination, the Reich Chancellery, the last bastion of Nazi Germany. By the time they arrived, it was 12:30 a.m. on April 25, 1945. Berlin was already consumed by war. The red glow of artillery fire flickered over the rooftops, and the air smelled of smoke and cordite. Krukenberg waited for 3 long hours inside the Chancellery's communications room. From there, he managed to inform Army Group Weichsel of his arrival. By 3:30 a.m., he was finally ushered in to see General Hans Krebs, Hitler's Army Chief of Staff. The general wasted no time with pleasantries. "In the last 48 hours, Krebs said bluntly, "we have ordered numerous officers and entire units to reinforce Berlin. You are the first to arrive." It was a grim confirmation of what Krukenberg had already suspected. The city had been abandoned to its fate. He was told to report that morning to General Helmuth Weidling, commander of LVI Panzer Corps, now Berlin's official defense commander. Meanwhile, SS Lieutenant General Fegelein, Himmler's personal liaison, was nowhere to be found. As dawn broke, the battered Charlemagne battalion woke to find their commander returning from the Chancellery. Krukenberg's expression was heavy. Berlin was now completely surrounded. Only the suburbs remained contested, with Soviet forces still pushing through in waves. The deepest Russian penetrations had occurred in Neukölln, the southeastern sector of the city. That was where they were needed. That was where they would fight. Krukenberg had just been placed in command of SS Division Nordland, now reduced to a shell of its former strength. Once a proud unit of Scandinavian volunteers, Norwegians, Swedes and Danes, the division had been torn apart by months of fighting. What remained of Nordland was 1,500 men, shattered and exhausted. and now the French battalion would be attached to it, an independent force within a dying army. From the forest, the men of Charlemagne watched as Hitler Youth patrols passed by on bicycles, their Panzerfausts slung across their backs like toys. Some of the Frenchmen sneered at the sight of child soldiers, others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The Third Reich was now being defended by teenagers. Then the order came. They were moving into Berlin. The men welcomed it. Anything was better than waiting. The battered trucks rumbled forward, engines sputtering as they rolled down the streets, deeper into the burning city. The noise of war grew louder, the deep howl of shells, the rattle of machine gun fire, and the distant boom of Soviet Katyusha rockets turned the city into a symphony of destruction. But something was unsettling. Despite the madness raging all around, the streets of Berlin still functioned. People walked as if nothing had changed, moving without haste, without panic. Trams still ran, shops remained open. Even in the shadow of total collapse, Berliners carried on their routines with an almost religious solemnity. It was as if they refused to acknowledge the end. Krukenberg arrived at the 56th Panzer Corps headquarters on the Hohenzollern-Damm. There, he met Colonel von Duving, Chief of Staff, before being taken to General Weidling. The encirclement of the city had been completed overnight, but the Soviet advance had stalled in most sectors, except Neukölln. That was where Nordland was fighting. The Charlemagne battalion was now reorganized for urban combat. It was no longer a traditional military unit. It was a collection of small 8-man teams, each led by an experienced NCO. There were no longer any battalions, no more conventional companies. Each section was an isolated fighting cell, tasked with defending its own street, its own building, its own ruins. Despite the chaos, the French entered Neukölln singing. Berliners, those who still believed in victory, gathered to applaud them, but others only stared in disbelief. What were these men fighting for? At Nordland's command post, the reality became clear. Krukenberg had been summoned to Berlin to replace SS Major General Joachim Ziegler, a career officer who had lost control of his scattered forces. The division had no cohesion, its units reduced to fragmented pockets of men fighting with whatever they had left. Ziegler had seen the writing on the wall. He had requested to be relieved. At noon on April 25th, command officially changed hands. Ziegler handed over his unit and left for the Reich Chancellery. Krukenberg would see him again on May 1st, but by then, the city would be in flames. The situation was worse than anyone had imagined. When Krukenberg sent for his French detachment, they arrived under fire, escorted in by Nordland's remaining trucks. The streets were filled with the wounded. German armoured personnel carriers, fresh from the front, rolled in carrying dying soldiers. As they reached the command post, French sentries tried to stop them, unsure who they were. In the confusion, a German soldier, mistaking the Charlemagne men for traitors, opened fire with a machine gun. 3 French soldiers were hit. It was a symbolic beginning to the final battle. By now, SS Division Nordland had been reduced to 1,500 men and just 6 self-propelled guns. The divisional artillery had already been sent to defend the Reichstag, while the supply and support elements were still in Pickelsdorf. This was it. One of Krukenberg's first orders was an attempt at control. No unit shall move without written approval. But it was pointless. The city was collapsing. Orders meant nothing when buildings were falling, streets were burning, and Soviet tanks were tearing through Berlin's heart. Krukenberg left his newly restructured command post and pushed forward on foot. He needed to see the front lines with his own eyes. At Hermannplatz, he met the Volkssturm commander, a local Nazi official who had set up his headquarters inside the Karstadt department store, overseeing the battle from its upper floors. Through shattered windows, Krukenberg saw the battlefield below. The Red Army was coming. This was the last stand of Berlin, and the French would fight to the very end. The Soviets had breached Treptow the day before. Now, they were pouring into the southeastern districts of Berlin, their numbers endless, their advance relentless. By the time April 26, 1945 dawned, what remained of the Charlemagne battalion was preparing for its next move. Their orders were clear: assist the Nordland division in launching a counterattack at 5 a.m. to retake Neukölln. But the chaos of Berlin's final days had already seeped into the command structure. The attack was delayed. At first the men stood ready, their weapons loaded, their eyes fixed on the darkened skyline. The silence was unnerving. 500 hours. Nothing. 0530. Still nothing. The men exchanged glances, uneasy. Delays like this were dangerous. Then, just before 0600 hours, the order came. The attack had begun. The French volunteers of Charlemagne moved forward in perfect coordination, advancing alongside Nordland's Panthers, Königstigers, and Sturmgeschütze. Their objective was clear the streets and buildings while providing cover for the tanks. It was a familiar dance, one they had learned in the rubble of Kharkov, on the frozen roads of Pomerania. But Berlin was different. As they pushed through the narrow streets, the Soviets were waiting. At first, there was nothing. Then, suddenly, the deep, methodical rattle of Maxim machine guns tore through the morning air, followed by the angry bark of anti-tank guns. The streets erupted into fire. The volunteers moved like ghosts, bounding from doorway to doorway, pressing against shattered walls as bullets zipped past their heads. From above, Soviet snipers fired from broken windows and rooftops, their shots picking off men one by one. Then came the first disaster. As Sergeant Olivier's 4th Company neared an intersection, a hidden Soviet anti-tank gun fired directly into them. 17 men vanished in an instant. The shells shredded flesh, shattered bones, sent bodies flying against brick and steel. The street was painted with blood. Olivier himself was wounded, along with several others. Officer Cadet Protopopov took command, leading the survivors forward, but the attack had already suffered its first brutal setback. Captain Henri Fenet, watching from the front, kept his men moving. They could not stop. The Red Army was dug in deep, forcing the French and Nordland Grenadiers to fight for every staircase, hallway and rooftop. Grenades were tossed into doorways before they stormed inside. Bayonets were fixed for close-quarters duels in darkened corridors, and machine gun fire shredded Soviet positions. For the Berliners trapped in the city, the sight was surreal. As Fenet and his men fought their way down the ruined avenues, old men and women emerged from their cellars. Some simply watched, stunned. Others offered water, bread, and coffee, pressing them into the hands of the foreign soldiers who were fighting for a city that was not theirs. "Drink up. You must be thirsty," they whispered. Some invited them into their homes, insisting they rest, offering whatever food remained, but there was no time to stop. The battle was changing. The further they advanced, the thinner the lines became. On either flank, contact with friendly units was breaking down. The streets were filled with smoke, rubble, and death, and soon Fenet's battalion was completely isolated. Then the order from division arrived. If the attack has not started, stop and await new orders. If not, do your best. What did it mean? Had the attack failed? SS Lieutenant von Wallenrod, Fenet's adjutant, rushed back to find out what was happening. When he returned, his expression said it all. "We're alone," he said. "No one else attacked. The Soviets launched their final offensive this morning. The entire city is collapsing." Fenet clenched his jaw. They had just taken half of Neukölln from the Soviets, and now they had to give it back. It was Heinrichswalde all over again, a battle won, only to be abandoned hours later. "What do we do, Captain?" von Wallenrod asked. Fenet glanced at his men, tired, bleeding, but still standing. "We stay," he said. "If the flanks stabilize, we can hold. If not, we'll decide then. But we will not let ourselves be surrounded." By now their position had turned into a salient, a wedge deep inside Soviet lines. The town hall became their fortress, reinforced by a band of Hitler youth, several hundred boys barely 14 to 16 years old. These child soldiers fought like devils, charging forward with Panzerfausts and rifles taller than themselves. They had no fear of death. They had no understanding of it. By noon, the Soviets were throwing everything they had at the French and Hitler youth holding the town hall. The ground shook as T-34s rolled forward in formation, their turrets swinging side to side, searching for targets. The Königstiger, hidden in an alleyway, waited. Then the first T-34 appeared. A deep boom shook the streets. The 88mm gun fired, and the Soviet tank exploded instantly, its turret popping off like a tin can. The next T-34 pushed forward. Another boom, another kill, but there were too many. The Russians kept coming, flanking from the side streets, sending waves of infantry to die in the rubble. Then, Corporal Millet, one of Fenet's best runners, was cut down by Soviet artillery fire. He hit the pavement face first and did not move. His body was carried inside, placed gently against a wall in the town hall. Another young French soldier, Roger, took his place. Roger had already fought 2 campaigns without a scratch, but Berlin had other plans. The battle dragged on for 5 hours. Men like Kapp and Fink, machine gunners, held the streets alone, shifting positions, spraying bullets with precision that unnerved the Soviets. For a while it seemed as though they could hold forever, but reality set in. They were cut off. Division had pulled back. Their only hope was to hold until nightfall and pray the Soviets didn't realize how vulnerable they were. But the Russians weren't fools. By late afternoon, hundreds of Soviet infantry pushed in from all sides. The T-34s rumbled forward again. The last Königstiger made its stand. The gun lowered. The first T-34 came into view. Boom! A direct hit. The Soviet crew never got out. The next one kept moving, turrets swinging. Boom! It exploded in a fireball. But the Red Army was endless. By sunset, Fenet was leaning on a crutch, a bullet lodged in his foot, still shouting orders. The French were exhausted, bleeding, low on ammunition, but they held on. Berlin was dying around them. The streets were littered with bodies, but the town hall still stood. Night was coming, and the battle was not over yet. By 7 p.m, the battlefield had turned into a living inferno. The shelling never stopped, the sound so constant that it was impossible to tell whether it was increasing or fading. Every street corner brought the sudden shock of an explosion, sending showers of brick and stone across the ruins. Dust filled the air, stinging the eyes, coating the skin, making it hard to breathe. If they were lucky, the blasts came from their own hidden tanks, still firing in the city streets. If not, it was Soviet artillery. Then the runners brought terrible news. Red Army tanks had reached Hermannplatz, just 900 meters behind them. Only 2 streets remained open for retreat, and they would not stay open for long. Captain Henri Fenet gave the order. It was time to pull back. With what remained of his battalion, along with the Hitler Youth fighters, he gathered them in the ruins and slipped away with the last of the Nordland tanks. The Russians did not interfere. The Soviets had already sliced through Berlin's defences like a hot knife through butter. There was no need to chase a few more doomed men. They reached Hermannplatz just in time. Barricades were being thrown together hastily, piles of paving stones, wrecked vehicles, anything to block the streets. The T-34s loomed in the distance, their engines growling, keeping a respectful distance. The Russians were probing for weaknesses. They found none. The Nordland assault guns opened fire. In the dimming light of dusk, Soviet tanks burst into flames one by one. Boom! A T-34 exploded, sending its turret into the air. Boom! Another was struck in the side, the crew scrambling from the burning wreck before being cut down by machine gun fire. The battle continued deep into the night, but the Soviet infantry refused to attack. The fires burned in silence. Then, at midnight, the order came. They were pulling back again. On the way, Fenet's No. 1 company, under Labadette, rejoined them. They had spent the day plugging holes in the Nordland's collapsing front. Fenet was relieved. His men were all that was left of the Charlemagne division. He wanted them to fight together, to die together if it came to that. But Berlin's defences were not what he expected. As he spoke with the defence sector commander, reality hit him like a bullet to the gut. "I thought the Berlin front was made up of organised units like ours," Fenet said. "If that were true," the officer replied coldly, "we wouldn't be standing here behind Hermannplatz." The truth was devastating. The entire defence of Berlin had collapsed. Proper fighting units. There were barely any left. Only the remnants of Weidling's Panzer Corps, some SS battalions, and a few thousand exhausted troops remained to face the full might of the Red Army. The rest? Hitler Youth. Volkssturm. Overage policemen. Men too young, too old, too untrained. They fought bravely, some with fanatical determination, but this was not enough. Berlin was a corpse still pretending to be alive. Before leaving, Fenet gave Labadette one last order. "Do not get involved. Whatever happens, come back." Labadette smiled, but there was something distant in his eyes. "You can count on me," he said. Fenet frowned. Something felt wrong. He placed a hand on Labadette's shoulder. "No, you don't understand. I mean you, personally, come back, alive." For a moment, Labadette hesitated. "See you soon, Captain." Fenet watched him disappear into the ruins, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. He shook it off. He was being ridiculous. Labadette would come back. He had to. By dawn on April 27th, the battalion regrouped near the Anhalter Bahnhof. The opera house would be their new stronghold. But the battle raged on. That morning, 30 Soviet tanks had already been destroyed, along with several anti-tank guns. The Red Army kept pushing forward, but for every street they took, they paid in blood. At the same time, Fenet's battalion was falling apart. His 4th company was down to 20 men. Many of them were barely standing. One of them, Officer Cadet Protopopov, somehow managed to shoot down a Soviet reconnaissance aircraft with a machine gun. A small victory, but it meant nothing. The walls of Berlin were caving in. By midday, Krukenberg relocated his headquarters to the Gneisenau police barracks, signaling to Corps Command that Sector C was lost. The Nordland Division was reassigned to the Gendarmenmarkt district, the final defensive perimeter before the Reichstag. By nightfall, Berlin was in flames. The streets were littered with the dead, but the Frenchmen of Charlemagne were still standing. Inside the opera house, Fenet leaned against a crutch, his bullet wound throbbing, his uniform soaked in sweat and blood. The Red Army was closing in. They would not stop. There were no more orders, no more reinforcements, no more illusions. This was the last battle. The French had come to die in Berlin, and tomorrow they would. The air was thick with dust and smoke choking the last defenders of Berlin. Shells screamed overhead, shattering what little remained of the streets. At every intersection, explosions sent waves of brick and rubble flying, shaking the earth itself. The noise was endless, an orchestra of death, impossible to tell if it was building to a crescendo or fading into silence. At times a distant boom signaled a German panther firing from the ruins, hidden like a wounded beast striking back in its final moments. More often than not, it was Soviet artillery, creeping closer with every minute. Then the runners brought word. Red Army tanks had reached Hermannplatz, just 900 meters behind them. Only 2 streets remained open for retreat. They wouldn't remain open for long. Captain Henri Fenet knew what this meant. If they stayed, they would be cut off, surrounded, annihilated. He gave the order, fall back. The last remnants of Charlemagne and the Hitler Youth Battalion pulled back under cover of their final surviving tanks, weaving through the ruins, rifles slung over their shoulders. The Soviets did not chase them. Why would they? Berlin was already dead. Hermannplatz was barely holding together when they arrived. The last defenders were hastily throwing up barricades, piles of paving stones, splintered wood, wrecked trams, anything that could slow the Soviet armor. Across the square, T-34s loomed in the twilight, their turrets slowly sweeping the streets, searching for targets. The Soviets were testing the defenses, waiting for the right moment to push forward. Then, the Nordland's assault guns struck first, a direct hit, and a T-34 erupted into flames. The Soviets hesitated. Another boom. A second tank exploded, sending flaming debris spiraling into the sky. The Germans had turned the square into a killing ground. From the rooftops, machine gunners raked the Soviets below, cutting down waves of Red Army troops trying to move up. From the side streets, Panzerfaust teams waited in the shadows, ready to ambush anything that moved. As darkness fell, the battlefield burned. The flames from destroyed tanks lit up the ruins, casting long shadows across the shattered cityscape. The Red Infantry never came. They had learned their lesson. For now. At midnight, the order came. They were pulling back. Again. On the way, Labadette and his No. 1 company rejoined them. They had spent the entire day plugging holes in Nordland's collapsing front, moving from one crumbling position to the next. Now, Labadette had new orders. A defense sector commander, one he didn't even report to, had pulled his company to seal yet another Soviet breakthrough. Fenet was furious. "He's not taking your men," he said. "You're all that's left of the Charlemagne division. If we fight together." The commander refused. He needed men. Fenet had no choice. Labadette's company was going back into the fire. Before he left, Fenet stopped him. "Listen to me. Do not get involved. No matter what happens, you come back." Labadette gave a tired smile. "You can count on me, Captain." Fenet saw something strange in his eyes, a hesitation, a distant look, a man walking toward his death. Fenet grabbed his shoulder. "Number you, personally. You must come back. Alive." Labadette paused, then, with quiet finality, "See you soon, Captain." They shook hands, and then Labadette disappeared into the ruins of Berlin. Fenet watched his silhouette fade into the night. A cold chill ran down his spine. As the battalion regrouped near the Anhalter Bahnhof, Fenet's frustration grew. Berlin's defense was in shambles. He had expected to find organized lines, battalions, regiments, even a semblance of structure. What he found instead was chaos. There were no organized lines left, just scattered remnants of Weidling's Panzer Corps, a few SS battalions, and some exhausted, half-starved Volkssturm and Hitler Youth. "Where is the rest of the army?" Fenet demanded. The response was blunt. "This is the army." Berlin had been abandoned. The defense now rested on broken, bloodied remnants, fighting not to win, but to die with honor. Fenet clenched his fists. "Then we fight." Fenne ordered the battalion to rest for a few hours. Von Wallenrot led them to a makeshift shelter inside the Thomas Keller near the railway station. It wasn't much, but it would do. Before following them, Fenne and his adjutant, Officer Cadet Duroux, went looking for a vehicle to take them to Nordland's command post. There was no fuel left. The city had nothing left to give. The command post itself was falling apart. No one even knew where General Krukenberg had moved to next. For now, all they could do was wait. The night stretched on. Outside, the flames of burning buildings reflected off the clouds, casting an eerie glow over the ruined city. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered, a reminder that the Soviets were still coming, and they would not stop. At dawn on April 27th, Krukenberg made his move. The entire Nordland division was being reassigned to the Gendarmenmarkt district, the last defensive perimeter before the Reichstag itself. The final battle was at hand. The Frenchmen of Charlemagne, what was left of them, would hold the Opera House as their final stronghold. There would be no more retreats, no more reinforcements, no more illusions. This was the endgame. Tomorrow, Berlin would fall, but tonight they still had a city to defend. The streets of Berlin were unrecognizable. Smoke rolled through the ruins like a creeping fog, and the distant thunder of artillery never ceased. The Soviet advance had shattered the city's defenses, pushing deeper by the hour. In the heart of the chaos, SS General Krukenberg made his way through the devastated streets, his uniform covered in dust, his mind racing. He needed to see Fegelein. Now inside the Chancellery, the air was thick with tension. Krukenberg wasted no time. He explained everything. The Nordland division was being fragmented, its commanders removed, its men thrown into the fire without direction. Defense Sector Z, meant to hold the very center of Berlin, was a fiction. It existed only on paper. If things continued this way, there would be no sector left to defend. Fegelein listened, unmoved, as if Krukenberg were speaking about a city in another world. Then General Weidling entered the room. His face was set with exhaustion, his patience thin. Krukenberg turned to him, arguing with quiet urgency. They had one experienced, battle-hardened formation left, and it needed to be fighting as a unit, under its own officers. If they tore it apart, the defense would crumble before the battle even began. Weidling exhaled sharply, annoyed, but he reluctantly agreed. The Nordland would remain intact, but its deployment was changed. SS General Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the Chancellery Defense, would take charge of the entire sector. The Nordland men would be positioned beyond Wilhelmstrasse, holding a defensive line that stretched through the ruins eastward toward Dönhoffplatz and Alexandrinenstrasse. Krukenberg knew what this meant. They were being sent straight into the storm. By the time he returned to the Opera House, now serving as Nordland's headquarters, it was nearly 1 a.m, April 27th. Nearby, in the shattered remains of Belle Alliance Platz, the French SS battalion was barely holding together. They had been whittled down to remnants of 3 companies, no more than 100 men. Captain Henri Fenne could barely walk, his foot mangled by a Soviet machine gun bullet. He had been carried to the cellars of the Reichsbank, slipping in and out of consciousness. When he woke, an elderly Wehrmacht officer helped him back to Nordland headquarters. Krukenberg met him there. He placed a hand on Fennett's shoulder, his expression grave but approving. The Frenchmen had fought like lions. "You and your men," he said, "deserve a rest." They would have the day to regroup. But rest was a luxury that no longer existed in Berlin. By nightfall, they would be sent into the ruins, reorganized into tank hunting squads, fighting alongside the last German armour on Leipziger Strasse. That morning, Krukenberg returned to the Chancellery. He met with General Krebs, who had one last glimmer of hope. Wenck's army. Word had just arrived. The remnants of the 12th Army had reached Werder, west of Potsdam. If Wenck pushed forward, if the Americans advanced from the Elbe, Berlin might still have a chance. But Krukenberg knew better. There would be no rescue. He left the Chancellery knowing that the men under his command were about to be swallowed whole. By midday, the city shook under constant Soviet artillery. Shells hammered the Opera House and the Schloss Berlin, forcing the headquarters to relocate to the Stadtmitte U-Bahn station. In the darkness of the tunnels, the French volunteers gathered in silence. Then laughter, a strange, defiant sound. They had just received their rations, chocolates, cigarettes, candy. Fennet, despite his wounded foot, grinned as his men stuffed his pockets full of sweets, as if preparing him for a long journey. The mood was almost surreal. They sang in the dim light of the subway cars, their voices echoing through the tunnels as if they weren't marching toward their deaths. But someone was missing: labor debt. The first company had never returned. By late afternoon, an officer cadet, de la Cars, arrived with a handful of men. Labadet was not among them. He had led his unit into the U-Bahn tunnels, holding an outer position near Hallisches Tor. Before leaving, he had given one last order: "If I don't return, go straight to the command post." He had not returned. No one knew what had happened, only that he had gone out on one last reconnaissance, covering his men's retreat with an MP-44 in hand. He had fallen in the tunnels, his body riddled with bullets. He was 22 years old. The men of the Nordland Division, battered and exhausted, continued to fight, but by now their positions in the city were collapsing. In the smoking ruins of Yorkstrasse, the first company had been left to hold the line with almost nothing. Only a handful of men, one remaining machine gun, and a few Panzerfausts. They were surrounded. A Wehrmacht major appeared from the rubble, frantic. The Russians were coming. 7 Soviet tanks rumbled through the broken streets. There was no time to think, only to act. A lone French soldier shouldered his Panzerfaust, took aim, and fired. The first T-34 erupted in flame, its turret blown clean off. The next moment, the Stalin organs screamed, their rockets tearing through the street, turning men into shadows against the fire-lit walls. By nightfall, there was no longer a front line, only a collection of isolated strongpoints, holding out block by block, street by street. Krukenberg, knowing the Nordland Division was shattered, demanded a new position, one last place to make a stand. He relocated his headquarters to the Opera House cellars, turning the Gendarmenmarkt into a final defensive zone. But the reality was clear. This was not a battle. It was the end. The command post was nothing more than an abandoned U-Bahn wagon, its windows shattered, its walls smeared with dust and blood. The air reeked of oil and burning rubber, and the dim glow of candlelight flickered against the station's damp concrete. This was Stadtmitte U-Bahn station, the so-called command post of the Berlin fortress. A sudden, violent tremor shook the underground as a shell ripped through the station's vaulted ceiling, sending chunks of concrete raining down like shrapnel. The blast echoed through the tunnels, followed by a sharp cry of pain. 15 wounded. The Nordland's senior medical officer, Colonel Dr. Zimmermann, oversaw their evacuation to the Hotel Adlon's air raid shelter near Pariser Platz. Fernet was there when it happened. The war outside was only getting worse. Reports filtered in. Wenck's army had reached the outskirts of Potsdam, but the Soviets had finally launched the offensive they had been preparing for weeks. The Oder front had collapsed. The Russians were already in Prenzlau, only hours away from encircling everything. Those who had remained in Neustrelitz waiting to reinforce Berlin would now be fighting their own hopeless battle. If Wenck broke through, he would find nothing but the dead. As night fell, no one slept. Every man knew that the Soviets favored nighttime infiltrations, their units slipping through the ruins like phantoms. The French SS battalion was ordered to establish sentry posts, its men disappearing into the skeletal cityscape. 2 anti-tank commandos set off for Belle Alliance Platz, now called Mehringplatz. The first was led by von Wallenrott, the second by Staff Sergeant Lucien Hennekart, a man who walked through shellfire as if bullets did not exist. He was 38, old by their standards, a figure of quiet legend. When warned about his recklessness, his reply was always the same: "I am already too old to make a corpse." But as the night dragged on, no one came back. The Nordland sector was crumbling, its commanders desperately requesting reinforcements. If this continued, the entire battalion would be thrown into the fire, one by one. Fernet, still hobbling on his injured foot, was led by Dureau over the rubble to the U-Bahn station, where Krukenberg briefed him on the situation. The French battalion was to be deployed at full strength to Belle Alliance Platz, the last line before the Soviet tanks reached Wilhelmstrasse and Friedrichstrasse. The path to the Reich Chancellery had to be closed. Fernet gritted his teeth and stood to leave. "Where are you going?" Krukenberg asked. "To get my men moving. We leave in 10 minutes. Krukenberg shook his head. "You can't even stand. Issue your orders from here and rest." Fernet's voice was ice. "General, it is impossible for me to remain here while my men are in action. It is impossible that you should not obey my orders." Krukenberg shot back. "Don't insist." Fernet clenched his fists, but said nothing. He remained underground as the battle above devoured the city. By 2:30 p.m. the first Soviet tanks had crossed the canal at Hallisches Tor. The Denmark regiment made a last, desperate attempt to demolish the bridge, but their explosives failed, leaving just enough space for T-34s to roll through. The first was destroyed on sight, but more pushed forward. By evening, Soviet armor was inside Friedrichstrasse, and the Denmark regiment was forced back to Kochstrasse. 6 Soviet tanks pushed all the way to Wilhelmplatz, reaching the very doors of the Reich Chancellery. By dawn on April 28th, the battle for Berlin had become a nightmare of steel and fire. The Nordland held fast, its burning front line stretching from Spittelmark to Kochstrasse. 5 Tiger IIs, the last of SS Panzer Battalion 503, had been deployed across Leipziger Strasse and the Tiergarten, their massive 88mm guns the last true weapons of war left in the city. In the underground, the French SS had spent the night either hiding in the Schauspielhaus cellars or waiting in Stadtmitte U-Bahn station. The atmosphere had become eerie, surreal. Candles flickered in the dark, their light barely illuminating the tunnels. Water dripped from ruptured pipes, pooling across the station floor. Every few minutes the ground trembled, not from footsteps, but from the constant thunder of Soviet artillery above. Krukenberg paced the underground. The reports were clear. Red tanks were massing at Belle Alliance Platz. He did not wait. 2 French anti-tank detachments were sent forward, one led by SS Lieutenant Weber, the other by Hennekart. The streets were a battlefield of twisted metal and collapsing facades. Friedrichstrasse had become impassable, its pavement ripped apart by craters and tank wreckage. But Wilhelmstrasse remained open, and that was where the Soviet armor was pouring in. Near the canal, a lone T-34 emerged from the morning fog, its turret scanning the ruins. Sergeant Eugène Volot did not hesitate. He raised his Panzerfaust, flipping the safety catch. He took aim. He fired. The detonation lit up the street, sending a plume of black smoke spiraling into the sky. The T-34's turret blew off, its insides instantly turned into a furnace. Volot didn't even flinch. It was his 4th tank kill. 2 months earlier, in Pomerania, he had destroyed a Joseph Stalin tank. In Neukölln, he had taken down 2 more Soviet machines. He was a plumber from Pantin, quiet, disciplined, a man who had never drawn attention to himself, until now. Then the Soviets retaliated. First came the 120mm mortars, their bombs turning the street into a kill zone. Then came the tank fire, 85mm shells from the T-34s, 122mm blasts from the Joseph Stalins, 57mm shots from their anti-tank crews. They fired directly at the buildings, blasting entire facades apart. Under this deafening chaos, the Russians tried to tow away the burning tank wrecks, clearing the path for their next push. But it was broad daylight. They had no cover. The French waited in silence, hidden behind rubble, and blasted out windows, gripping their Panzerfausts. The stench of burning bodies and rubber filled the air. The battle lasted into the night. Wilhelmstrasse was a graveyard of tanks. By April 29th, Sergeant Eugène Volot had destroyed 6 more. At dawn, in the underground gloom of Stadtmitte U-Bahn station, Krukenberg lit a single candle. The French volunteers gathered around. There, in the final hours of Berlin, he awarded Volot the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. His voice echoed through the tunnel, the flames casting shadows on the station walls. He spoke in French. "Your bravery matches the finest soldiers of history." In that moment, as the city above crumbled, the Frenchman stood a little taller. In total, 108 Soviet tanks had been destroyed in their sector, half of them by French hands. Yet everyone knew the truth. They weren't winning. They were just delaying the inevitable, and Berlin was running out of time. Clouds of dust and shaking the very foundation of their crumbling stronghold. The men instinctively ducked, their ears ringing from the impact as debris rained down from above. Through the choking dust, they could hear the mechanical growl of Soviet tanks repositioning, their steel beasts grinding forward once more. Sergeant Major Rostang, still disoriented, wiped the dust from his eyes and forced himself to stand, ignoring the pain in his ribs where the beam had struck him. Around him, his comrades were already moving, bracing themselves for yet another wave of Soviet armor. The battle had become a relentless cycle. Destroy a tank, fall back, brace for the next attack. And yet they fought on. Captain Fournette, leaning against a shattered doorway for support, called out for his runners. His injured foot throbbed, but he refused to let it slow him down. He needed to reinforce the new defensive line before the enemy could exploit the gaps. The remnants of his battalion were now dug in along Puttkamerstrasse, fighting from one burning ruin to the next. They had no artillery, no reserves, and barely any ammunition, only their Panzerfausts, MG-42s, and the sheer will to resist. The Soviet 120mm mortars resumed their grim work, pounding the French positions with terrifying precision. The explosions sent fire and masonry skyward, swallowing entire sections of buildings in flames. Somewhere in the chaos, Officer Cadet Protopopov was hit. He had been speaking to Rostang in the courtyard when a shell exploded nearby. The blast riddled him with shrapnel, cutting him down instantly. Nearby, Roger Albert crouched behind the broken remains of a window frame, his eyes locked onto the street ahead. He clutched a Panzerfaust to his chest, his grip steady despite the chaos around him. He had already destroyed 4 tanks. He was hunting for his 5th. A movement in the dust, another Soviet formation pushing forward. 7 or 8 tanks advancing in tight formation, hoping to overwhelm the Panzerfaust teams before they could fire. Albert grinned, his heart pounding. They had made a mistake. The lead tank, a T-34, rumbled into view, its turret scanning for targets. Albert rose, aimed, and fired. The rocket screamed across the street and slammed into the tank's lower hull, sending flames erupting through the hatches. The steel beast lurched forward another meter before shuddering to a stop, black smoke curling into the sky. The second tank behind it hesitated, too late. A second Panzerfaust streaked from the shadows, hitting its tread, immobilizing it in the middle of the street. The remaining tanks began to reverse, trying to tow their wrecked comrades back, but they never got the chance. The French gunners hit them again, forcing them into retreat. The men let out ragged cheers, but there was no time to celebrate. The next wave was already coming. Captain Fenet watched the burning street, exhaustion weighing on his body like a lead weight. They had held again, but the question clawed at the back of his mind. For how much longer? The bombardment did not let up. The Soviets tightened their grip, launching another coordinated infantry assault, this time supported by flamethrower units. Flames surged through the shattered buildings, licking at the wooden beams and forcing the defenders deeper into their ruined fortress. The wounded refused to leave. Those who could no longer stand propped themselves against walls, rifles in hand, determined to fire until the very end. Even Staff Sergeant Olivier, despite being wounded 3 times, refused to be evacuated. 3 times he had been carried away, and 3 times he had returned to the front. The French volunteers knew they were doomed, but not a single one surrendered. On April 30th, the last day of Hitler's life, the Soviets finally breached the battalion's perimeter. Their tanks pushed through the flames and rubble, pouring machine gun fire and high explosive rounds into the last French strongpoints. The last of the French grenadiers fought from room to room, stairwell to stairwell, until the buildings themselves collapsed around them. Roger Albert was last seen firing his Panzerfaust at a tank rolling into Wilhelmstrasse. Sergeant Major Rostang was buried in a collapsed building, but miraculously survived. Captain Fenet, covered in dust and blood, led the last survivors in a final, desperate breakout attempt. They fought until they ran out of ammunition, and then, one by one, they fell. By May 1st, only a handful of French SS remained. By May 2nd, Berlin was lost.